Hi, and welcome everyone. And this is the penultimate session in the Trellis Seminar Series 2021. For those of you who don't know us, Trellis is the charity that supports therapeutic gardening in Scotland, with over 480 gardening groups in our network. We provide information, training, and good practice sharing, and we aim to promote the highest quality of therapeutic gardening services and enable everyone to get the best out of them. Find links to all our resources online at the Trellis homepage. So today's session is approximately 60 minutes long. There's going to be a presentation followed by a Q&A session. So please use the chat feature to ask questions throughout the session, and a member of our team, Jo Cook, is going to voice these questions to the presenter after the presentation. We'll ask you for some feedback towards the end of the session, and we'll post a link to our survey in the chat. During the presentation slides, you can minimize your video thumbnails and move them to the side so that you can see the presentation slides clearly. So it's a real privilege today to welcome our speaker, Natalie McCall. Natalie's going to share her insights on developing a therapy garden informed by the psychiatrist Judith Herman's work on trauma and recovery. So Natalie has a wide range of Natalie's worked in a wide range of social and therapeutic settings across central Scotland in the last decade or so. I'm just going to spotlight her so you can see her. She works predominantly in areas of multiple deprivation, and she enjoys the challenges of building community empowerment and resilience through sustained action. So I'll pass you over now to Natalie, who's going to share her screen and her presentation with us. Thanks, Natalie.
Oh, thank you so much, Jenny, and thank you so much to everyone at Trellis for doing such an amazing job this week. It's just so different from being in the conference in real life in Perthshire, and I miss the presence of everyone and all the amazing bakery that the Field puts on for us every year. So thank you everyone for the audience for coming as well. It's just such a different way of presenting through a screen, but I hope that you enjoy the presentation today and that you can take something away from it. I think we've all had time to reflect during this time of COVID on our practice, whether we're from a therapy garden background or if we're more coming from a community garden background or whether we're policymakers. But for myself, it's been a really amazing opportunity coming just before lockdown, coming off a really busy 3-year project with multiple sites across the Central Belt, which had my head spinning for 3 years solid, into starting a much smaller partnership project last August, only on one site with quite a smaller cohort of participants. And it's been such a opportunity to just slow down, and I kind of feel like I've got back to the roots of what attracted me into this field in the first place. So I just wanted to start by saying that the sanctuary garden that we've been developing since last August has been put on hold until we're out of tier 4, so hopefully it won't be too much longer. But just to because of that, I thought rather than speaking specifically only about that project, that I would tease out the kind of best practices and approach that I've taken across developing a number of therapeutic spaces, and hoping that that will be useful both for those of us who are working in therapy gardens, but also increasingly for those who are in community gardens and getting social and green prescribing of vulnerable people into community garden spaces and are being asked to create a therapeutic gardening service within a community garden setting. So that's the kind of background to the way that I've tweaked the presentation. So at present, I'm working with Urban Roots. For those who don't know, Urban Roots is one of a number of large grassroots sustainability-based projects that is tackling the intersection of health and economic and social inequalities through doing work all predominantly around the environment. I was chatting to Emma Iller, who's the chief exec, yesterday, and she just came out with this phrase, we are creating a new sector. And it really struck me that it's so true that all these grassroots organizations are, over the last sort of 15 years or so, are bringing forth a new type of working. And I think that's being honoured more and more with the increasing number of green health partnerships. I think there's 5 at the moment in Scotland that are getting trialled, but I think that'll probably build up as time goes on. So Urban Roots, even through lockdown, has been doing, sorry, just get the next screen, has been achieving quite a lot. There's about 18 staff, most are working flexibly part-time, and then there's a lot of freelancers, and then there's 100 volunteers who've dedicated 5,000 hours across different community gardens, therapeutic gardens, woodland. They've been running community meals and outdoor clubs and different events, and also been doing training as well, which during lockdown I think is pretty impressive. For myself, I was reflecting on that. I feel like I'm on this kind of apex, if that's the right word, or fulcrum of balance between the amount of time that I've spent in community gardens versus the amount of time that I've been more focused in therapeutic gardens. And I was just really reflecting on what the differences are, or how I've experienced the differences. And I'll just give you a few minutes to a minute or so to read through that rather than myself reading through it. So what I think is what I've written in purple at the bottom is that I think that no matter whether we're in therapeutic garden spaces or in community garden spaces, oftentimes we are encountering to some degree or other similar issues around the intersection of social, economic and environmental disadvantages, which can manifest in some mental health challenges and also the impacts of trauma. And that can be quite big impacts on an individual, or it can be that kind of, just the impact of living and working in poverty across different generations. So bearing that in mind, I decided to have a look at what those challenges might mean for this increase in social green prescribing into the community garden sector. And especially I thought it would be useful to really look at where we are in terms of what space we're working in. And this is a kind of extreme example that I've set up of, on the left-hand side, we are in a clinical setting in a therapy garden where all the participants that we're working with have some kind of clinical diagnosis, and there's a whole team of people behind the participant who might be social workers, it might be the police, it might be the support workers working in the service, and that the social and therapeutic horticultural therapist is just one person that's working in a much wider team. A therapy garden tends to be a private space, a privately owned or managed space by whatever organisation the therapy garden is attached to, and it could often be a residential space or a space where participants travel to every day or a lot of the time to work there. And oftentimes the therapeutic goals that the horticulture therapist is working with are aligned with the support plans of the partner organisation, so that there's a partnership between the organisation who owns the garden and the goals that the horticultural therapist is supporting participants within that. At the other side of the scale is a community garden on the right hand side of the screen, which traditionally is an open space. It's open to the public, although it could be fenced as well. but it's open to local people. It's, you know, staffed by a community gardener who might be a paid member of the garden or might be a volunteer, open to the public. And the community garden's role is more about a friendly face and a helping friend, and or doing activities more around designing and planning and resourcing and running events and whatnot. So I'm just battling with Zoom at my side a little bit. And then, so that's the kind of two extremes that I've set up. And of course, I'm sure that people who have worked in both or work in either can, you know, understand that I've kind of set them up as opposites, and they're not always as straightforward as that. But I think that there's this growing betwixt in between space that social and green prescribing is creating between these two opposites, where people who are working in community gardens are starting to get social and green prescriptions, which are coming from, you know, a healthcare setting, and that staff in community gardens are being asked to take on areas of work that would more be associated with a therapy garden, around safeguarding vulnerable individuals, and also about, you know, organizing therapeutic activities. And there's just like a little red flag in me where the increase in funding for mental health at the moment, and especially, you know, dealing with the impacts of COVID, we're going to get even more funding for the mental health crisis that we've got on just now, is being given to health providers who, through green health partnerships, are using third sector organisations such as Urban Roots to do the delivery, but not necessarily with a good understanding of what the knowledge and the skill limits and boundaries of the staff are at present. So it's really to just try and support therapeutic gardens who are starting to do more of this work to have an understanding of how that can be transferred safely into therapeutic, into a community garden setting. So the way that I want to approach that was to offer the participatory approach that I take to any garden project that I've been working in, whether it's a therapeutic or a community garden, and then just sort of tweak it for a therapeutic approach. And this is an approach that some of you might recognise. It's a very common permaculture tool for those who are new to permaculture. Permaculture is a no waste design tool which you can apply to a garden or a project or a town or the world. It's a way of working with a no waste, and in this case probably a low carbon way of working. So the ones that are in green are the things that I'd like to touch on through the rest of the presentation. So in this, and I'll introduce the sanctuary garden now as well here. So the observations that I make, some of them is before I even visit the site for the first time. It's the information that I've got from whoever the client is. In this case, the client is the partners, who are the Simon community and the NHS. And I'm looking to find out what the big idea is, what's the background to the project, what are the policy drivers, the kind of higher up drivers, and then how is that being captured by a funding application, and how does that translate into a brief for me who's going to be trying to deliver stuff on the ground. And then so that's the sort of paper desktop information that I'd start with, and then I would be looking at doing client interviews on the site with all the staff, all the participants, and doing participatory surveys, so getting out tape measures and cameras and getting everyone involved in developing a relationship with the site together. So for this particular project, the background is that the Simon Community Scotland, which for those of us further afield is an organisation that supports people experiencing homelessness, they're the beneficiary. The therapeutic garden is based at one of their 5 women-only services in Glasgow. And then Urban Roots, who I work for, are providing the staffing on the ground. There's myself and another horticultural therapist who I think is on this presentation too. So hello to Kerry, if she's here. And then the third is the NHS, who are the funder. And the beneficiaries on the ground are working with women who are in crisis. There's around 150 women in Glasgow who have kind of travelled around through the care system and maybe into prison and onto the streets, and have a background of trauma, and many use addiction and self-harm as a coping mechanism to help them to live day to day with everything that they've experienced in their lives. So the background to the project was to pilot a 10-month pilot with a little startup pocket funding at the service, and the aims were to introduce the concept of social and therapeutic horticulture to the service, so the staff in the service and also the residents. And this is always the kind of designing the plane whilst flying it, designing the garden and garden whilst gardening side of it. And it can often be quite a slow process to capture people, especially if it starts, you know, at a time of year where there's not strawberries all the time. Strawberries are usually a good one for winning people, and also to connect and build relationships with the staff and residents, to develop areas of the garden and a seasonal programme of therapeutic activities, and then to use an approach that's informed by Judith Herman, who as a psychiatrist who's pioneered an approach around trauma and recovery. So the trauma and recovery model, a Herman model, is a new model for myself, and it's based on an understanding around attachment theory and psychology, that in order for us to survive things that have happened, then we need to find a way for us to make sense of what's happened to us, to make it into a story that makes sense to us, in order to be able to separate who we are from what's happened to us, so that we are not our trauma, we are not our chaos, we are, that is what's happened to us, but that is not who we are. It might change who we are, but it's not who we are. So it's a way of coming back into oneself. This is a very simple explanation of it. So there's 3 stages to the Herman model, and the first is around establishing safety. For those of us that work in gardens, I think we all probably know that the garden, by nature of it being outside, can be a safe space for certain groups of people that I've worked with in the past, especially asylum seekers and refugees. This is not the case. You know, being outside is where bad things have happened. So in those instances, having very clear boundaries, physical boundaries, like fencing and whatnot, to create a space that is outside of the public helps to make it a safer space. So the first, about establishing safety within the Herman model, is about establishing safety within oneself. So there's a lot to establishing safety, having somewhere safe to live, having safe people around oneself, feeling safe with one's own emotions and state of mind and mental health. So in a gardening setting, I think the garden can really lend itself within a much wider structured programme to supporting participants to start to regain a sense of trust and safety within themselves. And then the second stage is around remembrance and mourning, and that stage is about accepting the things that have happened and being able to make sense of them and find a meaningful way to be able to share with other people what's happened in a way that helps someone to reclaim that sense of self, a sense of dignity, sense of pride. And in the garden, the sanctuary garden, the residents had already started to make a little fairy garden memorial space that was honouring a resident who'd recently passed away. But it was and is a space that the residents and staff were also bringing other losses to, and it started to become a focal place in the garden that was participant led, that we were just building on, that became a space that could be used around remembrance and mourning for meaningfully for women. In terms of the nature of a garden as well, because we're so led by the seasons in Scotland, where there's this cycle of birth and death and loss and gain that's happening around the 4 seasons, we can use the garden, this cycle of the year in a garden, to honour this kind of loss as well, and to use the elements, earth, air, water, fire, space, to work with processing emotions. An example of that might be that we've tried is to write down things that we want to let go of on a bit of paper and then burn them in the fire, or equally to write down things that we want to attract into our life and burn them in the fire and let the smoke go up into the sky as a sort of fire prayer to the universe. Other ways of doing it can be, in Scotland, we've got the clutie tree, which is like a wishing tree where people would traditionally tie ribbons to branches to let go of things or to ask for things to come into their life. So that's, and then with the earth, we can bury things, and earth, air, water, we can dissolve things, and then air, we can hang things and let them blow in the wind. So we can use nature in a way to connect with the emotions that are going on with ourselves and outside of ourselves. And then the third stage, which is a recovery, I think that can be I think we can probably all relate to having had to recover from something in our lives. And again, we can use the cycles that take place in a garden in the sort of calendar of the year as a framework, and then to chunk that down into therapeutic activities that we can work with throughout the year. I'm just going to leave this for yourselves to read, but I think that it's a really lovely quote around what happens at a turning point in any of our lives. And I know that's certainly been the case for myself when I've experienced loss, that there's always some lovely event that a person's brought, or a moment with another person that's kind of helped me to bring myself back to life. And I think in a garden setting, we stumble over those opportunities every time in a session. So for the sanctuary garden, I had a quick look at the dictionary before I went on site to see what sanctuary actually means. And I was really happy to see that nature was the second definition. And then it went straight into the garden and asked all the residents and the staff what they thought what the idea of sanctuary meant to them. And that we took that as a starting place to think about how we could develop the garden and different garden rooms and garden spaces in order to come up with areas that introduce colour, that are warm, the use of plants, where places we can rest, to be alone, to be together, to gather, everything that they said that they wanted in a sanctuary garden. So that was observations, and now we're moving on to boundaries. And the boundaries can be physical boundaries, mental, emotional, funding boundaries, time constraints. I think it's really useful to be honest about what those boundaries are and to map them out in whatever ways that are useful for your project. So this is the garden last August, and there's a large residential house with a large kind of parkland landscape with mature trees around the boundary of a old walled garden, and a path, a circumambulatory path that goes all around the garden, which just really lends itself to the idea of a journey through the garden in a circle and what that might mean in terms of recovery. Beautiful space, amazing, and such a privilege to work in it. The photo on the left with, I don't know if you can see, but that's the start of the little fairy garden. And then there's there's a summer house that we can use, and then a little feature, there were the birds' houses on the right hand side. We turned that into a little sitting area. Now, I think I forgot to mention that I do apologise for the lack of photos in this presentation, but because it's going to be in the public domain, it wasn't safe to put photographs of any of their participants in the slides. So it's a bit death by PowerPoint on a Friday, I'm sorry. So one of the big things that is really important for in working in partnership is to have a partnership agreement, and that could be verbal or preferably a written document that outlines the roles and responsibilities for each partner and staff. It helps to develop a shared expectation, because in any partnership, where the nature of partnership is that each partner is bringing a specific knowledge that isn't shared by the other partner. So especially for conveying, introducing a social therapeutic gardening program to a brand new sector, it takes time. It isn't always obvious what's happening, and that it really helps to establish shared expectations. Similarly, things like photo consent are really important, as is confidentiality in the ways that any sensitive information about residents is written down and recorded, and of course health and safety. At the moment I'm doing a branching out training with Forestry Commission, and I was really pleased to hear that when they're talking about the partnership agreement for running that programme, that they really specify this idea of no spectators, that especially that support staff are participants as much as residents, because that helps to create a sense of equality in the garden, and it also hooks support staff into the project, because the therapist is coming, the horticulture therapist is coming and going, they're not there all the time. It's really important for support staff, so that you don't end up with a massive greenhouse full of plants that have died through the week because there's not that connection on the ground. And then in terms of resources, these can be natural resources, things like tools. In this project, because it's a therapy garden, the staffing was a lot more important than any of the other resources that we had. But for your own projects, volunteers might be a really key factor. And then there's always serendipity in any project. There's always like something magical that happens, and for this project, just getting donated garden furniture was something that just came out of the blue a few weeks ago, which was lovely. So the staffing for this one as a therapy garden is pretty intense. On the delivery team, there's myself and Kerry Park, another horticulture therapist. There's there was a project worker in the NHS and a storyteller, which has been fantastic. She's a storyteller that's I think she's doing a year with Simon Community, and she brings such a richness to the garden. And then the Joyce, who's on this too, Joyce is the Simon Community gardener who's been with Simon Community for I think about 16 years, and her role is to jump around multiple sites and work with residents to improve the gardens and to have a connection with residents, and she does a fantastic job. And then there's the service manager who runs the site, all of the women's services, and the support staff, who are a bank of support workers from all sorts of different backgrounds, and I really try to encourage support staff who I have no, managerial, I don't have a managerial relationship with. I really encourage them to bring their personalities into the garden and their skills. And so this particular site, we have an artist, and then we have someone that's like really into holistic therapies, and they just bring such a wonderful quality to their presence in the garden. And then on the strategy team, there's the three partners: the head of women's service, the funder, and the manager. Communications around that can be really important to delegate who's doing what. For this particular project, the funding wasn't really that big a deal because the garden is just so incredible that, I mean, it's a therapeutic space in itself, but we did have a little pot of startup funding from NHS, and then we got a little spot fund from Action Earth, who are just fantastic at supporting therapeutic spaces at the moment in Scotland. You know, we had to really think about our working arrangements through COVID, and also working with specific vulnerable adults. And because this was a new area for myself and Kerry, the other horticulture therapist, it was really important that we received training around why people self-harm, introduction to the Herman model, and then we also have provided training around what is social therapeutic horticulture to the services and to the staff through Zoom and online, sort of ongoing conversation. So another part of the design, and apologies in advance if anyone wants to hear lots about designing gardens, but I decided really that it would be more useful to look at the design of the actual garden sessions and then design of a seasonal program, because designing gardens is, you know, can be an all-day subject. So first of all, the design of sessions, I think that it's really useful to have a slow, steady, seasonal approach to the design and the delivery of sessions, because the benefits of social and therapeutic gardening are accruative over time. I mean, there can be big changes, but it tends to be a slow and steady sort of plod through the year, and to be able to create a sense of safety, especially within this Herman model, then having routines and familiarity just takes away the anxiety of the unknown to people who are also, you know, dealing with a lot of chaos on a daily level anyway. So this is an idealized version of how I like to run things. It's not how things happen on the ground a lot of the time, but when I've seen it working, it really works. So having establishing a really safe routine around the beginnings, the middles and the endings, and to have sessions that are very participant led, which means for ourselves that we need to have a lot of activities and projects that we can pull out the hat on the day, depending on who turns up and what they feel like doing and what their energy levels are like and whatnot. This project also had a really interesting staff to participant ratio, that the engagement's been quite low with the residents, but we've had a lot of staff. So there's like, I mean, I've never worked on a project where there's 2 staff horticulture therapists, and it's been a joy. Plus we've had Joyce the gardener, and then support staff, storytellers sometimes, and then residents, and it's made for a really interesting experience where the residents have really benefited. I mean, I would think they might be quite intimidated, there's so much stuff, but actually residents have really enjoyed when they've been the only person in a session, because they've had a lot of support from different staff. I'm just going to go on to the next slide. So this is my idealized heavenly idea of running a therapeutic garden session. So the beginning is all about getting resources organized. If other projects, I've asked the support staff to get all the tools out and set up for when we arrive, so that, you know, we can just dive straight in. Other times, if some of the therapeutic goals are about building independence and autonomy, then it'd be up to the participants to get everything out and organized. This project, it tends to be myself and Kerry that have been doing it. And then I really like starting with a check-in circle. A circle is a shape we find in nature, in every plant, every flower, and it helps to build confidence in people. They don't have to speak or get involved, but over time they tend to. And it's just a way of grounding a session. I quite like to have a check-in where we're doing some kind of check-in around people's mood, and over time that might be words, or, you know, I'm feeling red with anger today, or do you know, express yourself in a dance move. Some past gardens really like that approach. or a colour, using an emotional barometer, like on a scale of 1 to 10, how are you feeling today? What animal do you feel like, what plant, you know, just over time using different approaches just to keep things moving. Some kind of physical warm-up, you know, in groups where it's been wheelchair users, we've done lots of stuff with our hands and their, you know, moving heads. In other gardens where people have more mobility, then it'll be more jumping around. It's really nice for participants to take turns to lead the little warm up, and then having an opportunity to share. There's usually something that's happened of interest through the week that someone wants to share, and then starting to divide up people into groups and staffing and organise. If anyone wants to use peer-to-peer support, where a resident has learned about, for example, sowing a seed the week before and then they want to pass that on to someone else, it's really nice to help build up people's confidence that way. And then introduce any adaptive gardening techniques for anyone that, you know, might need a little stool to sit on, or put a bamboo cane up a hose pipe to, you know, to get a reach if someone's in a wheelchair. Just little quick and easy techniques that can make a difference from removing obstacles and barriers to participation. And then in the middle session tends to be about demonstrating a new task or tools, using motivation, asking support staff to use motivating language. And then for a theme, if there is a theme, it could be like an emotional theme, it could be a seasonal theme, whatever. Sometimes we use a theme, sometimes not. Countdown to tea break or the end of the session, and most important, I should have written that in red, is remember to take photos or have someone that's dedicated for taking photos. Tea break, I think the most important thing is for the horticulture therapist to sit back. It can be really tempting to leave the tea break circle and to get set up for whatever's happening after the tea break, but often it can be a time where it's really important to just be there, but without speaking. And then the endings, I like to keep similar to the beginnings, with a wind down and a checkout. And the checkout circle and check-in circle can be really useful over time to record changes within a session to people's mental health and well-being, and then also to plot that over time. And usually I'll sit in the car after the session and write up my garden diary, because by the time I get home I'll have forgotten what's happened. The garden design, I'm just going to skip over. I'm aware that time's ticking on. Then for a seasonal program of activities, this is the bit that I really enjoy, and it changes all the time. It changes depending with the client group, but within this particular project, through taking residents and staff through this participatory process, the residents and staff identified the things that they wanted to do. So we started at the tail end of summer, and we did some sort of surveying, getting to know the garden, a bit of desktop design, and, you know, cutting out bits of paper and making like a map. And then we developed different garden rooms. Like we played around with where the sheds were to make a workshop area between them. Previously the doors had been facing not in the right way, so we turned them so they faced each other, and some of this big gold tree, and suddenly we had this wonderful workshop space to work with. So really quick and easy things. And we made a kitchen bed which was just outside the kitchen back door as a way, and planted it with herbs, and it was a way to try and encourage people out into the garden to work on engagement, and put in a few different sort of seating areas. In the autumn it was more about planters, which we're hoping to paint and plant up again soon. And then Kerry, whose background is more herbal based, she got involved with doing some lovely activities around herbs. and there's an elderberry in the garden, making some elderberry cordial, which was absolutely delicious. Halloween, we had pumpkin carving and around a fire with what you call it, marshmallows and treats. And the storyteller came in for there and worked on the fairy garden. And then in the winter, just before we got put on hold, we got loads of bulbs in and started to open up the views from the big house into the garden, which had a massive green screen of overgrown plants blocking the light and the view to the garden. And again, that was about connecting with the garden to increase engagement, and things like wreath making. But especially for the sanctuary garden, it's we're really trying to find a balance between being participant led, what the women want, versus trying to drive forward a project, because when engagement becomes low, then we still have to try to do something, and trying to find that balance between the empowerment that comes from participants doing stuff from themselves versus the impact of that work on the garden setting can be a real balancing act. And then we went on hold. So we're hoping that now that things are starting to open up, we'll be back on site within hopefully the next few weeks or so. And then I'm aware that I'm only got a few more minutes left, but I think that the monitoring and the evaluation of any project is something that therapeutic gardening and community gardening can be seen as a bit of a chore, but something that we do for the funders, for our project reports. But for myself, I think I'm a bit of a monitoring and evaluation nerd, and it's an area that really interests me, because for me it's a way of really seeing the shifts through time and the benefits that the participants are getting. And it's also a way for evidencing what we're doing, because we're not an allied health profession yet, on par with music or art therapy or occupational therapy. So that's why we're always a bolt-on rather than a profession in itself. So the main tools that I like to use within sessions are participant observation, which is quite a fancy way of saying that whilst I'm in it, I'm also observing it. And then that's what I'm scribbling down in my garden diary. So I'm looking for things that people have said, how they look, if they're, are their clothes a bit disheveled, is that unusual for that person? Where are they on that day, and what happens within a session that is useful information to chart. And similarly with staff, I really like to keep an eye on how staff have experienced sessions, and especially with a sort of check in, check out around mood, because that can be a really good way of embedding their participation if they're seeing that they're getting something out of it as part of their workday. The before and after questions games, that's kind of check in, check out. And I think a photo diary is probably one of the main tools that we use across therapeutic and community gardens. And it can be something that can so easily, we can forget to take photos because we're just so in it. I tend to take photos because I'm a bit of a control freak, but I mean, I would love it if I could really encourage participants or staff to take on that. And sometimes we're using cameras anyway if we're running a little photo session to, make a nice art display. And then the garden diary is like my kind of key tool. It's usually covered in mud. So it's what I do when as soon as the session's finished, I just take 10-15 minutes in the car before I go off, and that's when I'm writing down who was there, what happened, and just capturing the kind of messy, rich narrative detail of a session. And then afterwards that gets put onto a master spreadsheet, and that captures the kind of both slow and fast changes, where I can look down a spreadsheet and see who's been there, what's happened, and refer back month by month or year by year. And it can be a really good way of plotting individual journeys for people. And then one of the last things is that in a social care setting, social care settings, social care organisations tend to use some kind of support planning tool to support participants with whatever goals that they've got. In this setting, the goals are around securing accommodation, you know, working on addiction, and that the garden is a setting that, if we use that language and that narrative of the this social care, then they can see the support staff see the benefits, because they can see that the garden is adding to what's already happening in the service rather than being a bolt on. And then I guess the last thing that I would really like to say for the gardens and the day-to-day is to celebrate everything, because even if, you know, we've just planted a seed that day, it might be the first time someone's planted that seed, and we don't know the journey it took them to get out of bed and into the headspace to be able to get into the garden to plant that seed. So it's just so important to celebrate everything. And then quick reflections. I think with the rise in social and green prescribing, that the benefits of social therapeutic gardening are growing much faster than the allocation of funding that we're getting, and that's probably going to increase with the mental health crisis facing us from COVID and long COVID. And that when we're putting together funding apps, I think it's really important that there is a substantial training budget for all staff. So in this particular project, it was really important for Kerry and myself to get skilled up around the Herman model, where there's always going to be a challenge in Scotland for engagement. Partnership agreements are essential. And I think we really need to start looking at developing either a social or therapeutic horticultural qualification or ecotherapy qualification as a way to get over this problem that we have as a profession, that we're not an allied profession on the NHS framework. And hopefully that's something that we can work towards in the coming years. And that's me. Thank you so much. I hope that it's been useful and helpful. And I'm sorry that I've ran over a few minutes. I'll just shut down the screen sharing, Jenny, if we're going to questions.
Thank you, Natalie. We'll just hand over to Jo. I'll ask her to unmute and hand over to Jo to voice the questions. Natalie, that was absolutely superb and loads of detail to inspire and inform us. So I think there's quite a lot of questions here. So I'll hand over to Jo.
Great, thank you. Lots of lovely comments coming in, Natalie. Hopefully I'll get a chance to see them, but how amazing and motivating that presentation was. But I do have a few questions. So Louise had asked, what training is required to deliver horticultural therapy as opposed to therapeutic horticulture? And we have said that this will probably be covered in Diane's presentation this afternoon, but if it's something you want to answer, then carry on.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to Diane's presentation. She's coming from an American perspective, isn't she, of horticultural therapy, which is a different model to in Scotland and in the UK. So in Scotland, Trellis, wonderful Trellis, is the go-to for training. And over the years, I think I've probably done every single training course that Trellis has put on. And each job that I've done training with the organisation. So for this one, it was all around the Herman model. And other projects, it's been around gender-based violence or working with schizophrenia, working with forensic clients. So yeah, it's a patchwork training that I think would be wonderful to have something that's a bit more mainstreamed and organised. Two bits of training that have been really important for my development outside of Trellis have been the mental health first aid course, and then also ASSIST, which is applied suicide intervention skills training. And both of them were 2-day courses that you can sometimes find funding for online. And I'm also training to be a counsellor at the moment, which is something that I've increasingly started to bring into my own practice around empathic listening and that kind of thing.
Lovely, thank you. Hopefully that answers Louise's question. But Louise said, do come back to us, Trellis, if you want to know more. Angela asked, how long are your sessions and how often do clients attend, and how long can they attend for? What's your kind of, I know this is a pilot project at the moment, so.
Yeah, the sessions that we've been running in the sanctuary garden tend to be about 2 hours long. Other projects, I've made them more like 3 hours long, especially if I'm on a site for a whole day, like have a 3 hour in the morning and then a break, and then a 3 hour in the afternoon. But especially for that kind of idealized session format of a beginning circle, the middle tea break, more middle bit, and then an end. I think that the minimum requirement is I would say to run a decent session would be a 90-minute session at the minimum. And it really depends on the size of the group as well. Sometimes it's easier to manage in big groups because you can chunk them up and then be the person that's running around different groups. Yeah, so sorry, Angela, that's a bit of a waffly answer, but I think it really depends on the number of participants, number of support staff, and what the task is as well, and what people's additional support needs are.
Lovely. A couple of people have asked about photos, and then you obviously mentioned the photo diary. So Jenny asked, what do you do with the photos, and do the participants use them to reflect on their gardening? And I was thinking, do they even use it though to reflect on, say, their own journey or the progress they've made for themselves? And somebody else asked, do you only take photos of the tasks being done, or do you include the participants in the photos?
Yeah, so I take photos of everything. I really like to get photos of people doing things. I like photos of people doing tasks with their hands that we can then make into a how-to guide, like a how-to guide to sowing a seed that's from the participant's perspective, and we can make that into like a little booklet. I like taking photos of groups of people together, something celebrational that can be a memory that can go into memory box or into like a diary on the site, or an art photo exhibition at the service. In past projects, we've made up little photo albums, journeying the development of a garden. There's loads of ways that you can use photos. And Joyce, who's the gardener at the SAM community, has been really kind of printing out specific photos to give to residents for something that's caught her eye and said, oh, I think that person would really like that photo. So yeah, photos are such a wonderful resource. And for some people who don't have access to a camera, it can be really powerful to see themselves in a photograph using a power tool, or it can be used as an empowerment tool and a memory tool and an invoking joy tool and a funding report tool. All sorts of ways to use photographs. In terms of storing them, it depends on the photo consent arrangement with, and I always get the word wrong. Is it GRDP, GPRD?
GDPR.
Thank you, Jo.
You got the letters.
Yeah, so that in past projects we've set up a photo consent where the vulnerable adult has worked for quite a long time, like up to 6 months, with a support worker around understanding what photo consent means, and then they've given photo consent for the whole project. Other projects we need photo consent verbally every time we're going to take a photo, so that's the kind of whole range. And then the photos that I have photo consent to use for all time are photos that I could use in a presentation, but because this one's online and being recorded, it's just a bit too risky.
I understand. Couple of questions. They're probably similar. Sally had asked, what are the long-term plans for the project? And John also asked, what happens to clients or what will happen to clients when they leave this project? Would they continue gardening, say, through other projects in urban roots, or perhaps even engage in a community project? What's the kind of thought process for their journey?
Yeah, both really useful questions. So for John's question, this particular gardening project, the aim is to get women into their own secure housing, and Simon Community have kind of got a policy for helping women to move on by not encouraging relationships that tie them to a service. So, for example, in a project I did with Migrant Help, the anti-slavery project, we set up a welcome garden at a secret site where asylum seekers, refugees that had been rescued came to, and were in that temporary accommodation until they got a place of their own. And we set up a sort of peer-to-peer approach where the people, once they'd moved on, would come back and help support the newbies and keep the garden going, and it became a sort of peer-to-peer approach. That isn't an effective approach for this particular setting because of the nature of the work. The NHS funder is also funding a lot of other projects with urban roots, and that's really the nature of why I wanted to do this presentation, because it's about that betwixt and between space. You know, how do you help support someone go from a therapy garden, safe setting, into a community garden or mainstream volunteering? That gulf is far too big for people. So to try and set up this betwixt and between space where community gardens can start to offer a boundary of therapeutic gardening within a mainstream setting is probably the approach that we're being asked to do at the moment on very limited funding. I've forgotten Sally's question, if you could just say it again.
Sally was, what are the long-term plans for the project? I think there's a pilot at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a pilot and it's up in the air, Sally, at the moment. Hopefully, once we get going and we build on engagement and get, embed the concept within the service, then it'll grow arms and legs. But it's too early in the process to know at present. Ideally, it would become, a successful example that the Simon community could start replicating around their other services.
Great, thank you. We've got lots of questions about whether the slides could be shared afterwards or made available, so we can speak to you about that afterwards and see if that's possible, and if we can, we will. The session is being recorded, so this will be available for people to access on our YouTube channel, hopefully in a while, next week or so. Another couple of questions. One from Margaret: is there a quiet corner for those who find it even difficult to talk or engage and be part of a group on a, either as an ad hoc basis, or on an ongoing basis?
Yeah, I mean, that's such an important question, Margaret, in any garden space and in thinking through the design of a garden. And it's in this particular garden, the sanctuary garden, I mean, it's such a huge space. It's more like a parkland, and it lends itself to the development of different garden rooms. So in any garden space, I think it's really important to create little nooks and crannies that people can withdraw to as they need. Having worked a lot with adults that are on the autistic spectrum, that's just sort of second nature now for garden design to create those spaces. But thanks for asking that, Margaret.
Just another couple of questions. I'm conscious of time as well, but Marie asked, do you have one-to-one sessions more often than group sessions?
It's been a bit of a mix, actually. The sessions where the storyteller's been there, and then the sessions where we've had a fire going and, kind of storytelling around a fire, have encouraged bigger groups. Other sessions have been, it's not been one-to-one, it's been one participant to multiple staff. So then we've kind of worked in a little group together. I'd say it's probably been about half-half. I'd have to go back to my master spreadsheet, but probably half-half, in the engagement levels decreasing with proximity to getting to, Christmas time, which is a really triggering time of year for people. And also the shift in the weather to the harsher weather for being outside. Yeah.
So that was a question. I can't see who it was from now, but there was one question. What is on your master spreadsheet? What kind of information goes in there?
Oh, I'd be happy to share that too. I've got like the date, who was there, participants, who was there, staff, activities, funding required, important information, which tends to be the kind of rich ethnographic stuff, and then any other business which is more kind of a concern or a risk column, like of, you know, what risk assessments needed to be done, or what's, you know, what was there anything that happened there. And that's my that's my master spreadsheet. I'm happy to share that, and also a pro forma partnership agreement, and also the presentation of their useful tools for people.
That's fabulous, thanks. That's wonderful, Natalie. I think that's covered pretty much everybody's questions. Hopefully we've answered them all, and I'll just hand back over to Jenny.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to put us on gallery view because I'd like to invite everyone to show their appreciation to Natalie. If you hover over your reactions, we can give a round of applause or some other form of celebration. I think that was absolutely tremendous, and lots of comments coming in there to say it's an absolute inspiration. And
thank you so much.
Truly a gift to hear about this today is one I'm quoting from Laureen there. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you for listening to me blethering on, and I'm so sorry there weren't exciting photos, but just, you have to come to the real conference next year.
Thank you very much, Natalie.
Okay.
Well, everyone, thank you so much. And just a quick thank you to all of you who have already donated to Trellis. If you've enjoyed today's session, please consider making a donation, because this helps us to support future work like this. And you may be interested in our plastic-free gardening book offer. It's on offer this week, and we'll have a link for you in the chat if you'd like to get the discount code and have a look at that. So I'd like to bring this session to a close. Thank you very much, Natalie, for sharing that with us. That was absolutely brilliant. And thank you to all of you for being here and sharing with us in this session. There's one more session left this afternoon in our seminar series 2021. And if you go to the website, it's possible to sign up for that if you are inspired to do so. And so I'm just going to say goodbye from all the Trellis team and from Natalie. Thank you very much for being with us. Goodbye.